Number 10. Aruj Barbarossa, the Ottoman corsair who died with a silver arm and lost his head to Spain. Before there was a golden age of Caribbean piracy, before the Jolly Roger ever snapped in an Atlantic breeze, there was Aruj. Born on the island of Lesbos around 1474, he grew up on Ottoman shores watching Christian galleys prey on Muslim shipping. He and his 3 brothers were sailors, then they became something else. By the early 1500s, Aruj was operating out of North Africa hunting Spanish and Italian merchant vessels with a ferocity that earned him a nickname all over Europe, Barbarossa, Redbeard. In 1512, during a raid on Bougie in modern Algeria, a Spanish cannonball tore off his left arm at the elbow. Most men would have died from the shock alone. Aruj survived and had a silver prosthesis fitted in its place. From that moment on, the corsair with the red beard and the silver arm became the face of Muslim resistance across the western Mediterranean. He took Algiers in 1516. He installed himself as sultan. He turned the city into a base for a naval war that would ripple for 4 centuries. And that is exactly why Spain wanted him dead. In May 1518, Emperor Charles V arrived at the port of Oran with a plan. He sent the Spanish governor, the Marquess of Comares and Garcia de Tineo, at the head of a force numbering roughly 10,000 professional soldiers, plus thousands of Bedouin allies. Their target was Thames, an inland Algerian city Aruj had recently seized. Aruj had roughly 1,500 Turkish troops and 5,000 Moorish soldiers. He held Thames for 20 days. He held it against artillery, against sappers, against Spanish steel, and then the population of the city, exhausted by the siege, opened the gates. Aruj knew what came next. He barricaded himself inside the Mechouar Palace with 500 Turks. When the supplies ran out, he slipped out with the survivors and tried to flee. According to Spanish accounts, as he ran along the road toward the Muluya River, he scattered gold, plate, and jewels behind him. The idea was simple. Every Spanish soldier who stopped to scoop up a fistful of coins was one soldier not chasing him. The Marquess of Comares understood the trick immediately. He shouted at his men to keep marching. Do not stop for gold. Do not stop for silver. Kill the corsair first, riches later. They caught Aruj on the banks of the river. He was cornered, running with a silver arm and no shield, and the Spanish were on him in minutes. What happened next was not a duel. It was slaughter. Aruj was cut down alongside his brother Ishak, and the last handful of Turkish soldiers still with him. When the fighting stopped, the Spanish took what they came for. His head was cut from his shoulders and preserved. His famous red cloak, that unmistakable signature of the Corsair King, was stripped from his corpse. Head and cloak were sent north. The head was displayed on a pike at Spanish Oran as proof, then sent onward to Spain. The cloak was carried to a church in the Iberian Peninsula and hung as a trophy of Christian victory, an offering to the god the Corsair had spent his life defying. For centuries afterward, Spanish churchmen would point at that piece of red fabric and tell visitors it had belonged to the man who once ruled the western Mediterranean. Aruj Barbarossa built an empire from a stolen island port. He died sprinting through a dry riverbed with a silver arm flashing in the Algerian sun. His victims, the crews of Spanish merchant vessels, at least received Christian burial when their bodies were recovered. Aruj was denied even that. His body was left in the dust, his head became a souvenir, and the man who inherited his cause, his younger brother Hayreddin, would spend the next 30 years reminding Spain that killing a Barbarossa was easier than killing the idea of one. Number 9. Klaus Störtebeker, the Baltic Sea pirate who watched 70 of his men die before his own head hit the ground. If you have never heard the name Störtebeker, that is because most English speakers have not. But in Hamburg, in Bremen, in every port city along the North Sea and Baltic coast, his name still means one thing: pirate. In an execution so grotesque that it survived as folklore for 600 years. Klaus Störtebeker was born sometime in the mid-14th century in northern Germany. His real name is disputed. His nickname is not. Störtebeker translates roughly to empty the tankard, and he supposedly earned it in a Wismar tavern by draining a 4-liter mug of beer in a single pull without setting it down. That is the man. Big, loud, dangerous, and in the 1390s the most feared naval captain in the entire Hanseatic trading world. He commanded the Victual Brothers, a fraternity of privateers originally hired in 1392 by the Dukes of Mecklenburg to break the Danish siege of Stockholm by smuggling food and supplies into the starving city. That is where the name came from. Victuals, food, but once the political job ended, the brothers did not disband. They turned pirate. They set up base on the island of Gotland at the ravaged port of Visby, and from there they attacked Hanseatic merchant shipping across the Baltic and North Sea. Their motto, still carved into the plinth of a bronze statue in Hamburg today, translated to God's friend and all the world's enemy. For nearly a decade, they raided everything that floated. Then, in 1401, Hamburg had enough. The city outfitted a fleet under a commander named Simon of Utrecht, and Simon set out to find Störtebeker. He found him near the island of Heligoland in the North Sea. According to legend, the fight would have gone Störtebeker's way except for a traitor in his own crew. A man who had been paid by Hamburg agents to pour molten lead into the chain links of the ship's rudder mechanism. When Störtebeker tried to maneuver, his ship would not respond. Simon's fleet closed in. Störtebeker and his men were taken alive. They were brought to Hamburg aboard the vessel Bunte Kuh, the Motley Cow, and dragged in chains before the city senate. The verdict was simple: death by beheading. Every last man. On October 20th, 1401, they were marched out to the Graubruch, a marshy island in the Elbe just outside the city walls that served as Hamburg's public execution ground. Around 73 members of the crew were sentenced to die that day. Some accounts say 74. The exact number is lost. What is not lost is what came next. Legend says Störtebeker offered the mayor of Hamburg a chain of pure gold long enough to encircle the entire city if his life could be spared. The mayor refused. Then the pirate made a final request. Kill me first, and however many of my men I can walk past after my head is off, spare them. The mayor, sensing theater, agreed. Störtebeker knelt. The executioner brought down the axe. The head rolled. And, according to the folklore that Hamburg still tells its schoolchildren, the headless body of Klaus Störtebeker stood up, walked past 11 of his condemned men, and would have walked past more if the executioner had not stuck out a leg and tripped the corpse. The mayor, having watched a headless body embarrass him, broke his promise and ordered the remaining 62 or so pirates beheaded anyway. The blood on the Grassbrook that afternoon is said to have run in streams. Whether the headless walking really happened or not, and no serious historian believes it did, the mass execution itself is well documented. Contemporary Hamburg records show a bill submitted around this period for the digging of 30 graves for Victual Brothers, which likely represents the men buried immediately, with additional dead disposed of elsewhere. Störtebeker's head was mounted on a pike on the Grassbrook alongside his men. His skull, according to Hamburg tradition, remained on that pike for years as a warning to any sailor considering the pirate life. A cranium, excavated on the same site in 1878, was long believed to be his, though modern DNA analysis has cast serious doubt on the identification. His famous drinking tankard, the same one from the Wismar Tavern legend, was displayed in Hamburg's town hall as a trophy until the Great Fire of 1842 destroyed it. His victims, the Hanse merchants he had robbed for years, at least died at sea in the confusion of combat. Störtebeker died on a stage in front of a crowd with 70 of his own men lined up behind him, waiting their turn. It was, and remains, one of the largest single-day mass executions in the entire history of European maritime crime. Number 8, Olivier Levasseur. The French buccaneer who spent 7 years hiding then swung defiant with a treasure map around his neck. His crew called him Le Buse, the buzzard. He earned that name because when he saw a prize on the horizon, he did not chase it. He plummeted onto it, ripped it open, and stripped it clean. Olivier Levasseur was born in Calais around 1690 to a bourgeois family educated as an architect and trained in Latin and Greek. He was, by pirate standards, a nobleman. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713, thousands of privateers were suddenly out of legal work. Levasseur was one of them. He drifted to the Caribbean, sailed with Benjamin Hornigold and Sam Bellamy, and then moved his operations to the Indian Ocean, where the prize hunting was fatter and the Royal Navy thinner. For years, he raided Portuguese and Arab shipping between Madagascar, the Seychelles, and the Comoros. Then in April 1721, off the island of Reunion, Levasseur pulled off the score that made him a legend. Working with the pirates, John Taylor and Jasper Seeger aboard the ships Victory and Cassandra, he captured the Portuguese great ship Nossa Senhora do Cabo. She was carrying the Archbishop of Goa, the Viceroy of Portugal's Indian possessions, and the treasures being repatriated from the East Indies: gold bars, silver, chests of diamonds, and, according to legend, the Flaming Cross of Goa, a solid gold cross studded with jewels so heavy it took several men to carry. It was one of the richest single takes in the entire history of piracy. Levasseur took his share and vanished. In 1724, when the French government offered an amnesty to Indian Ocean pirates, he almost took the deal. Almost. The condition was that he surrender his loot. He refused. He preferred the run. For the next 7 years, Lebuse lived as a fugitive, working as a ship's pilot along the Madagascar coast under assumed names, moving between hidden coves in the Seychelles archipelago. He aged. He watched his old crewmates hang one by one. He hoarded whatever he had left. And then, in 1730, a French naval vessel finally caught him working as a pilot near Fort Dauphin on Madagascar. He was arrested, chained, and transported aboard the warship La Méduse to Saint Denis on the island of Bourbon, which today is called Reunion. The trial was brief. The verdict was death by hanging on July 7th, 1730, at 5 p.m. in the tropical heat of the Indian Ocean. Olivier Levasseur was marched to the gallows. And here, according to a legend that has proven impossible to kill, he did something no other pirate has done. He turned the moment of his own execution into a puzzle that has taunted treasure hunters for nearly 3 centuries. As the noose was tightened around his neck, Levasseur is said to have torn a leather necklace from his throat, hurled it into the crowd of spectators, and shouted in French, "Mes trésors à qui saura comprendre." My treasures to he who will know how to understand. On the necklace, inscribed in a pigpen cipher of 17 lines of geometric symbols, was allegedly the location of the Nossa Senhora treasure, a key to millions. Then the trapdoor dropped. Levasseur died at the end of the rope, defiant to the final second, refusing to reveal the location of a fortune that has never been found. His body was buried at St. Paul on Reunion, where his grave, marked with a stone skull and crossbones, still attracts visitors 3 centuries later. The cryptogram, if it ever existed as described, has never been definitively decoded. Treasure hunters have chased it across the Seychelles and Madagascar and the Comoros. Some have spent decades digging. Some have died in the surf trying to blow open coastal rock formations they believed contained the vault. Nothing has ever been recovered. The victims of Levasseur, the Portuguese sailors of the Nossa Senhora, the Arab merchants of the Malabar coast, the crews of dozens of smaller ships he plundered, died at sea in blood and salt water. Levasseur died on a gallows. Alone, half his life spent hiding in swamps and creeks, watching his fortune rot uselessly in some jungle hole. And even now, on that same island of Reunion, if you ask the older residents, they will tell you that Lebuse's real punishment was not the rope. It was the 7 years before it when he lived like a dog in a tropical jungle while millions in gold sat somewhere he could no longer reach without being caught. Number 7, Jack Rackham, the pirate they called Calico Jack, whose lover screamed the most brutal farewell in maritime history before he was hung and locked in an iron cage on a rock in the Caribbean. He was not the fiercest pirate of his age. He was not even the most successful. But of all the men on this list, none had a death scene quite as humiliating as the one Calico Jack Rackham received on November 18th, 1720. Rackham earned his nickname from the calico cotton clothing he wore, bright, patterned, expensive, entirely impractical for a working sailor. He had a taste for showy shirts and trousers, the way modern gangsters might dress. He began as quartermaster to Charles Vane, but in 1718, off the coast of the American colonies, Vane refused to engage a French warship. Rackham accused his captain of cowardice. The crew voted. Rackham took command. Vane was cast off in a small sloop with a handful of loyalists. From there, Rackham's career had two chapters. In the first, he took a royal pardon in the Bahamas from Governor Woodes Rogers and briefly tried to live honest. That did not last. He fell in love with a red-haired woman named Anne Bonnet, the wife of a small-time informant for the governor. She left her husband for Rackham. When the two could not obtain a legal annulment, they simply stole a sloop out of Nassau Harbor in August 1720 and sailed off into a second illegal chapter. Aboard that stolen sloop was another woman disguised as a man, Mary Read. Together, Rackham, Bonnet, and Read attacked small fishing boats and merchant sloops around Jamaica and Cuba for a few months. They took modest prizes, they avoided major confrontations, and they became notorious not because of the size of their scores, but because of the two women in the crew. In October 1720, Rackham anchored his sloop, the William off Negril Point, on the western tip of Jamaica. They were drinking, all of them, heavily. A pirate hunter named Jonathan Barnett, sailing under a commission from the governor of Jamaica, spotted the sloop and closed in. When Barnett's ship came alongside and demanded surrender, Rackham's crew was so drunk they could not run out their own guns. According to contemporary accounts, only Anne Bonnet and Mary Read stayed on deck to fight. They cursed the men below, they fired pistols, they swung cutlasses. Bonnet reportedly shot one of her own crewmen who refused to come up and fight. The two women held the deck alone until they were overwhelmed. The men below, including Rackham, surrendered without significant resistance. Barnett took the entire crew back to Jamaica in chains. On November 16, 1720, Rackham and his male crewmen were tried in Spanish Town before Vice Admiralty judges. The verdict was swift: piracy, guilty, death by hanging. Rackham was granted a final visit with Anne Bonnet in his cell. There is no record of what she said to him, tenderly if she said anything tender at all. But the words she left him with, recorded and repeated by every serious pirate history since Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account, are the coldest goodbye any pirate ever received from any lover in any age. Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. Rackham was executed on November 18, 1720, at Gallows Point in Port Royal. His body was cut down, coated in tar to slow decomposition, and locked inside a custom-made iron gibbet, a cage shaped roughly like a human silhouette with bands of iron across the chest, hips, and legs. The gibbet was then hoisted onto a wooden post at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor on a small island the locals had previously called Deadman's Cay. Every ship entering the port passed within 100 yards of Calico Jack's rotting body. Within weeks, the flesh had gone. Within months, only tarred bones remained inside the iron. Seabirds picked at what was left, and Deadman's Cay was renamed, in his honor, Rackham's Cay. It still bears that name today. Anne Bonnet and Mary Read were tried a week later. Both were sentenced to hang. Both, in the standard maneuver of the age, pled the belly. They claimed to be pregnant. The court verified both claims and postponed the executions. Mary Read died in prison from fever a few months later. Anne Bonnet simply vanished from the historical record. Some accounts suggest her wealthy father in Charleston bribed her release. Others say she died in prison too. No one knows. What we do know is that Rackham, the man who dressed like a peacock, and captained two female pirates, ended his time on Earth in an iron cage swinging over Caribbean water. His victims, the small fishermen and merchant sailors he had robbed, mostly went home to their families. Rackham never went home. He hangs, in name at least, above that rock in Kingston Harbor still. Number 6. Stede Bonnet, the wealthy plantation owner who bought a pirate ship out of boredom and wept like a child at his own hanging. Of every pirate on this list, Stede Bonnet is the strangest. He did not need to be a pirate. He was already rich. He owned a sugar plantation on Barbados, inherited from his father who had died when Stede was 6 years old. He held the rank of major in the Barbadian militia. He was married to Mary Lambie, a fellow member of the Barbadian planter elite, and they had 3 living children. He was 29 years old in 1717 when he did something that has never made complete sense to any historian since. He walked away from his family, his plantation, and his social class and bought a pirate ship. Not captured, bought. He commissioned a 10-gun sloop, named her Revenge, hired a crew of 70 men at proper wages rather than the standard pirate profit share, and set off to hunt merchant shipping along the American coast. Contemporary accounts and modern historians have offered various explanations: boredom, depression, a shrewish wife, according to some pirate chroniclers, possibly mental illness. Whatever the reason, Bonnet was clueless from the beginning. He did not know how to sail. He did not know how to fight. His crew, real sailors, watched him with a mixture of contempt and pity. In the summer of 1717, off the Virginia coast, Bonnet was so badly wounded in a fight with a Spanish warship that he could barely stand. Half his crew died. He retreated to Nassau to lick his wounds, and in Nassau he met the one man who could truly ruin him, Edward Teach, Blackbeard. Blackbeard took one look at Bonnet, the awkward gentleman playing pirate, and recognized an opportunity. He offered to take temporary command of the Revenge while Bonnet recovered from his wounds. Bonnet agreed. Blackbeard never gave the ship back. For most of a year, Bonnet lived aboard Blackbeard's flagship Queen Anne's Revenge as a kind of house guest, spending most of his time reading in his cabin while Blackbeard's crew ran his sloop. In June 1718, the partnership imploded. Blackbeard deliberately grounded the Queen Anne's Revenge, and Beaufort Inlet marooned most of his crew, took the loot, and disappeared. Bonnet, humiliated and finally in sole command of the Revenge again, tried to reinvent himself. He renamed the sloop Royal James. He adopted the alias Captain Thomas so he would not lose the royal pardon he had recently accepted from the North Carolina governor. And he raided merchant shipping in Delaware Bay through the summer of 1718, actually taking 13 prizes. He was starting to become dangerous. Then Colonel William Rhett came for him. In September 1718, Rhett cornered the Royal James in the Cape Fear River. After a 6-hour battle, Bonnet surrendered. He was taken to Charleston in chains. He escaped custody by dressing as a woman and hid on Sullivan's Island for nearly 2 weeks before being recaptured. And on November 10th through 12th, 1718, in front of Judge Nicholas Trott, he was tried for piracy on the sloops Francis and Fortune. Bonnet pled not guilty on the first charge and defended himself by arguing that his crew had done the pirating while he had been asleep. The jury did not believe him. He was found guilty. On the second charge, he changed his plea to guilty. Judge Trott sentenced him to hang. Then Stede Bonnet did something no other pirate captain in this countdown did. He begged. He wrote a long, tearful letter to Governor Robert Johnson pleading for his life. He offered to have his arms and legs cut off, to be maimed permanently, if only he could be spared the noose. He offered to be sold into service in the West Indies. He offered his plantation. He offered anything. Johnson refused. On December 10th, 1718, at the sandy spit called White Point at the tip of the Charleston Peninsula, in a spot now called White Point Garden, Stede Bonnet was marched to the gallows. Contemporary accounts describe him as a broken man. He carried flowers in his hands, a strange detail preserved in the trial records. He was crying. He was pleading. When he reached the platform, he collapsed and had to be helped to his feet. The noose was placed around his neck. The trapdoor opened. The gentleman pirate died. His body was left hanging until the tide came in over him, then buried in the marsh below the low water mark, the customary disposal for pirates, so that even in death they lay outside the jurisdiction of Christian ground. His victims, the crews of the Francis and the Fortune and the other small vessels he had robbed, were mostly released alive after handing over their cargo. Bonnet, the wealthy amateur who chose piracy as a hobby, wept his way through his own execution. His plantation went to strangers. His widow eventually remarried, and his name became, and remains, the answer to the trivia question, Who was the pirate who bought his own ship and cried at his hanging? Number 5. Charles Vane, the pirate who refused a royal pardon by firing cannons at a governor, then was betrayed by an old friend on a beach and hanged in his own harbor. Charles Vane was different from Rackham and Bonnet. Vane was a real pirate. He was cruel. He was defiant. He was the last major captain in the Bahamas to reject the king's pardon, and he was one of only a handful of men who ever publicly humiliated the pirate hunter Woodes Rogers. Vane's origins are almost completely unknown. He appears in the historical record in 1715 as one of the crew of Henry Jennings raiding the salvage camps of the wrecked Spanish treasure fleet off the Florida coast. He appears again in 1717 in Nassau, a full captain in his own right, and a leading member of the loose confederation of pirates that historians now call the Flying Gang. In July 1718, Governor Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau with royal ships and an offer: take the king's pardon, renounce piracy, and live free. Most pirates took the deal. Blackbeard took it briefly, Bonnet took it, Rackham took it. Vane refused. And to demonstrate his refusal, on the night of Rogers' arrival, Vane set fire to a captured French prize, cut his cables, and rammed the burning ship down the harbor at the Royal Fleet. Under cover of the flames and smoke, Vane and his crew slipped past Rogers and escaped into the open sea. It was the most spectacular refusal of a pardon in the entire golden age of piracy. For the next 6 months, Vane raided along the American coast. He captured, tortured, and interrogated captured sailors so brutally that court documents later cited him for cruelty even by pirate standards. In November 1718, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, Vane made the mistake that ruined him. He encountered a French warship. He judged the French vessel too strong and ordered his crew to break off the engagement. His quartermaster, one Jack Rackham, accused him of cowardice. The crew voted. Vane was deposed. He and a handful of loyalists were cast off in a small sloop with almost nothing. Rackham took command of the main ship. Vane spent the next few weeks trying to rebuild. Then in February 1719, a hurricane in the Bay of Honduras smashed his sloop against an uninhabited islet in the Bay Islands. Nearly all his men drowned. Vane and one other survivor washed ashore alive on an empty rock somewhere off the Honduran coast. They survived on turtles and shellfish, and they waited. Weeks passed. A ship finally appeared. Vane hailed the vessel. To his shock, the captain of the passing sloop was an old acquaintance of his named Holford. Vane and Holford had known each other in the Caribbean for years. Vane assumed he was saved. Holford recognized the marooned pirate immediately. He refused to take Vane aboard. He is recorded as telling him something like, "Charles I shan't trust you aboard my ship, unless I carry you a prisoner. For I shall have you plotting with my men, knock me on the head, and run away with my ship." A pirating. Holford threatened that if he came back through the area within a month and found Vane still alive on the island, he would take him to Port Royal in chains. And then he sailed away, leaving Vane marooned. Not long after, a second ship stopped for water. Vane, using a false name, signed on as an ordinary deckhand. He was free. He was heading toward another chance. Then his luck broke completely. The ship he had joined encountered Holford's vessel again at sea. Holford came aboard for a friendly captain's dinner. He recognized Vane immediately. He told the ship's captain who this new deckhand really was. Vane was clapped in irons on the spot and delivered to the authorities in Port Royal, Jamaica. He rotted in prison for over a year. On March 22nd, 1721, he was tried for piracy in a vice-admiralty court and found guilty. On March 29th, 1721, Charles Vane was hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal. His body was cut down, tarred, and locked in a gibbet cage. It was suspended on the small islet called Gun Cay at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor so that every merchant ship arriving in the port passed his rotting body first. His victims, the crews of the ships he had robbed and tortured, at least had the chance to escape if they surrendered fast. Vane spent his final years first marooned on an empty rock eating turtles, then betrayed by a man he considered a friend, then a year in a Jamaican dungeon waiting for a rope. The famous Defiance, the fire ship that refused pardon, The escape from Woodes Rogers, all of it ended in a cage on a quay in the harbor he once terrorized. No.4 François l'Olonnais, the French buccaneer, they called the flail of the Spanish, who was pulled apart alive by native warriors and burned to ash so that no trace of him would remain. Some pirates were opportunists, some were businessmen. François l'Olonnais was a torturer. He was born Jean-David Now, around 1635, in the coastal French town of Les Sables d'Olonne, which is where his sea name comes from. As a young man, he was shipped to the Caribbean as an indentured servant. He served out his term on Hispaniola, then joined the community of French buccaneers on the island of Tortuga. He began raiding Spanish shipping and Spanish coastal settlements. And from the first raid, his defining trait was cruelty. His accounts, recorded by the Dutch buccaneer surgeon Alexandre Exquemelin, who sailed with the same crews, describe practices that turned the stomach. When Spanish prisoners refused to reveal where valuables were hidden, l'Olonnais would tie a rope around their heads and twist it with a stick until their eyes bulged out of their skulls. He was known to cut a still living prisoner's chest open with his cutlass, pull out the heart, and bite into it in front of the other prisoners to speed up their cooperation. He is documented, according to Exquemelin, as having done exactly this during his overland assault on the Spanish city of San Pedro on the Central American mainland. His nickname, Flail of the Spanish, was earned honestly. In 1666, he assembled a fleet of 8 ships and 660 men and sailed against the Spanish city of Maracaibo on the coast of what is now Venezuela. He took the city. He tortured the population for weeks to force them to reveal where their wealth was hidden. He moved on to Gibraltar, farther up Lake Maracaibo. He tortured that population too. When he sailed away, he had extracted an estimated 260,000 pieces of 8, plus tons of trade goods and jewels. In 1668, he sailed for Nicaragua to repeat the trick. Everything went wrong. Bad weather scattered his fleet. His main ship ran aground on a shoal off the coast of Darien, in what is now Panama. He and a small band of surviving buccaneers went ashore to look for food and to try to march overland to a friendlier port. That was his final mistake. The interior of the Darien Peninsula was, and is still today, one of the most impenetrable jungles in the Americas. It was also the territory of the Kuna people, an indigenous nation who had suffered decades of Spanish and buccaneer violence and who had extensive knowledge of who was doing what to whom along that coast. The Kuna knew exactly who l'Olonnais was. When his party of desperate, starving buccaneers stumbled inland, the Kuna surrounded them. The fight was brief. Most of the buccaneers were killed on the spot. L'Olonnais himself was taken alive. What happened next is preserved in the account of the sole buccaneer survivor of the group, who lived through captivity and eventually made it back to Spanish territory to tell the story to Exquemelin. According to that account, the Kuna warriors, aware of who they had captured, decided to make his death an act of erasure. They stripped him. They cut off his limbs, one at a time, while he was still alive. They threw each limb into a fire. They cut apart his torso. Piece by piece, the man who had bitten out a Spanish soldier's heart was fed still breathing at the start into a bonfire on the jungle floor. When there was nothing left, they threw his ashes into the wind. Exquemelin recorded the survivor's words in a passage that has echoed through pirate history for 340 years. The locals tore him in pieces alive, throwing his body limb by limb into the fire and his ashes into the air, to the intent that no trace nor memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature. Some later accounts suggest the Kuna ate parts of him too, though the survivor did not describe this specifically. What is certain is that no body was returned, no grave was made, no relic was preserved. There is no headstone anywhere on earth for François l'Olonnais. His victims, the Spanish villagers of Maracaibo and Gibraltar, and San Pedro at least, died with their bodies intact and were buried in consecrated ground. L'Olonnais died in pieces on a jungle floor, and his ashes were scattered by a wind that owed him nothing. His younger contemporaries in the buccaneer community, Henry Morgan among them, are recorded as having spoken of his death with something close to relief. A monster of the buccaneer age. they seemed to feel had finally received the exact death he had spent 10 years teaching others how to inflict. Number 3, Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, who had his throat torn out by grape shot at breakfast, and whose crew paid for it with the largest mass hanging in pirate history. If you measure a pirate's success by the number of prizes taken, no pirate on this list, no pirate in history, comes close to Bartholomew Roberts. Born John Roberts in Pembrokeshire, Wales, in 1682, he was serving as third mate aboard a slaving vessel called the Princess of London in 1719 when the pirate Howell Davis captured his ship off the coast of West Africa. Davis pressed Roberts into service. 6 weeks later, Davis was killed in a Portuguese ambush at the island of Principe. The pirate crew, needing a new captain, elected the newly captured Welsh navigator. Roberts accepted with a shrug and a line that has been quoted ever since. "Since I have dipped my hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it is better being a commander than a common man." What followed was a 3-year career of extraordinary violence and organization. Roberts issued a written 11-article code of pirate governance, one of the most detailed democratic codes of the era. He captured, by conservative estimates, around 400 vessels between 1719 and 1720, 2 more than any other single pirate in recorded history. He operated in a giant loop from the Caribbean to Brazil to Newfoundland to West Africa, moving faster than any Royal Navy squadron could track. He hanged the governor of Martinique from his own yardarm in April 1721, after capturing a French warship, an act that finally convinced the British Admiralty that Roberts had to be stopped at any cost. The Royal Navy dispatched Captain Challoner Ogle in the frigate HMS Swallow, with orders to find and kill Roberts specifically. On February 5th, 1722, Ogle located Roberts' fleet at Cape Lopez off the coast of what is now Gabon in West Africa. Ogle disguised the Swallow as a merchant ship. Roberts' consort vessel, the Ranger, under Captain James Skyme, chased after what looked like a fat prize. Once the Ranger was far enough from Roberts' main ship, the Royal Fortune Ogle ran up the white ensign, revealed the Swallow's true broadsides, and hammered the Ranger into submission. 10 pirates died. Skyme was captured. 5 days later, on February 10th, 1722, Ogle sailed back to Cape Lopez to find the Royal Fortune still at anchor. Roberts and his crew had been drinking through the night celebrating recent captures. Most of the crew was still drunk when the Swallow appeared on the horizon. One of Roberts' men, a former Royal Navy sailor named Armstrong, recognized the frigate immediately and alerted the captain. Roberts, according to eyewitness accounts, was still eating his breakfast. He put down his fork, put on his best clothes, a full crimson silk waistcoat and breeches, a hat with a red feather, and a gold chain around his neck bearing a large diamond cross, and went topside to fight. What followed was, and remains, the most abrupt end of any major pirate in the Golden Age. As the Swallow closed, and the 2 vessels swung parallel, a tropical storm began to blow across the anchorage. The Royal Fortune and the Swallow exchanged broadsides. Robert stood on his own quarterdeck directing the battle. And then, as the Swallow's swivel guns fired a load of grape shot across the pirate's deck, a piece of iron shot no larger than a penny caught Bartholomew Roberts in the throat, tore through his windpipe, and severed his spinal column. He died instantly, on his feet, in his crimson silks, before he could even collapse. His crew, honoring a standing order he had given them years earlier, grabbed his body, weighed it down, and threw it overboard in his full finery gold chain and diamond cross and all, before the Royal Navy could board. He was never recovered. His body lies somewhere on the seabed off Cape Lopez in silk that has long since rotted next to a cross that would be worth a fortune today if anyone could find it. The Royal Fortune, its captain gone and its crew still drunk, fought on for hours before surrendering. 272 pirates were taken into custody. What followed in April 1722 at the British fort at Cape Coast Castle in what is now Ghana was the largest single pirate trial in history. 65 of the captured men were black Africans who were sold into slavery on the Royal African Company plantations, an especially grim fate. Of the remaining approximately 200 men, 74 were acquitted, 17 sentenced to imprisonment in London, 20 sent to indentured servitude with the Royal African Company, and 52 sentenced to hang. The gallows at Cape Coast Castle ran for days. Contemporary accounts describe rows of bodies swinging in the West African heat. It was, by pure numbers, the largest mass hanging of pirates in the entire Golden Age. The victims of Bartholomew Roberts, the crews of 400 merchant vessels, mostly survived. Roberts generally accepted surrender and released his prisoners after taking their cargo. His own crew, 52 of them, died on a rope in Ghana. Roberts himself lies in fine clothes on the seafloor off Cape Lopez, killed by a piece of shrapnel the size of a coin. The most successful pirate in history received one of the most sudden deaths, and the death of his cause ended the golden age of piracy. Number 2, William Kidd, the privateer, who was hanged twice because the rope broke the first time, then tarred and displayed above the Thames for 3 years, as a warning to every sailor who saw him. William Kidd was born around 1645 in Dundee, Scotland. He is, in many ways, the pirate who was not really a pirate hanged for political reasons in a case that even his executioners knew was murky. He served with distinction as a privateer for the Crown in the Caribbean through the 1680s and early 1690s. He married a wealthy widow in New York. He was a respectable ship captain who owned his own pew in a Manhattan church. In 1695, he was commissioned by a syndicate of powerful English lords, including the king himself, William III, to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean and to attack French shipping. He was given a royal commission in a purpose-built ship, the Adventure Galley 34 guns, oars for movement in calm weather, one of the finest privateering vessels ever built. Kidd sailed for the Indian Ocean in 1696. Everything went wrong. His crew, half of them, deserted at Madagascar. Disease killed many of the rest. Kidd found few pirates to hunt and no French shipping to attack. Under pressure from a rebellious crew demanding prizes, he began attacking neutral vessels. In January 1698, off the coast of India, he captured the Quetta merchant, an Armenian ship sailing under French passes, carrying an extraordinary cargo of silks, sugar, opium muslin, and calico worth roughly 70,000 pounds. The problem was the French passes were suspect. The ship was actually chartered by important East India Company merchants, and the political fallout in London was immediate. Kidd was declared a pirate. His noble backers, terrified of political ruin, distanced themselves from him. When Kidd returned to North America in 1699, still believing he could clear his name by producing the French passes, he sailed to Boston and was arrested by his one-time patron, the Earl of Bellamont. The French passes, the documents that might have saved him, mysteriously vanished from official custody. They would not be rediscovered until 1910, more than 2 centuries after his death, in a bundle of papers in the British archives. Kidd was shipped to England, held in Newgate prison for over a year, and tried in the spring of 1701. He was convicted of the murder of one of his own crewmen, William Moore, whom he had struck on the head with an iron bucket during a mutiny, and of 5 acts of piracy. The judges refused to hear his defense that the French passes had legitimized the Cadea merchant capture. He was sentenced to hang at Execution Dock in Wapping along the north bank of the Thames. On May 23, 1701, William Kidd was led from Newgate Prison in a horse-drawn cart, preceded by the Admiralty Marshal carrying the silver oar that symbolized the jurisdiction of the Lord High Admiral over crimes on the sea. The procession made its way through Wapping to Execution Dock, a permanent scaffold set up at the low water mark on the Thames foreshore, where crimes committed under the Admiralty's jurisdiction were punished within reach of the tides. A large crowd gathered. Kidd, to the shock of the attending chaplain, was drunk. He had somehow acquired liquor on the way, and by the time he reached the scaffold, he was unsteady on his feet, mumbling, muddled. The noose was placed around his neck. The cart was drawn away from the scaffold. The rope pulled tight. The rope snapped. Kidd fell into the Thames, mud below the scaffold, still conscious, still choking, still alive. The chaplain, according to his own written account, rushed forward to exhort Kidd to repentance in this second chance at eternity. Muddy, gasping, humiliated, in front of a crowd of hundreds. Kidd was hauled to his feet, dragged back onto the platform, a fresh rope thrown around his neck, and hanged again. This time the rope held. His body was left dangling until three tides had washed over it, the traditional Admiralty punishment. Then it was cut down, coated in thick black tar to slow decomposition, and locked into a custom-fitted iron gibbet cage that had been forged specifically for him. The gibbet was carried downriver to Tilbury Point at the mouth of the Thames estuary, where every ship entering or leaving the port of London had to pass. There, at the water's edge, William Kidd's tarred body was hoisted onto a wooden post and left to swing in the wind. He hung at Tilbury Point for 3 years. Sailors coming home from voyages saw him. Merchants departing for the east saw him. Foreign vessels arriving from Europe saw him. Wives, children, apprentices, dock workers, tax collectors, everyone who used the River of London saw the body of William Kidd. His victims, the sailors of the Quedagh Merchant, and the smaller vessels he had taken, mostly went home unharmed. Kidd, the privateer who may or may not have actually been a pirate, was executed twice, tarred, and displayed as a warning above the busiest port in the world for the length of an average sailor's ocean voyage. The French passes that could have saved him sat unread in a filing box for another 209 years. Number 1, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard the Pirate, whose death on a shallow sandbar in North Carolina involved 5 gunshots, 20 sword wounds, and a beheading, and whose head hung from the bowsprit of a Royal Navy sloop for the return voyage to Virginia. If you know only one pirate's name, you know his. The reason is his death. There has never been an execution scene, formal or informal, in the entire history of piracy that matched the raw physical destruction of the Battle of Ocracoke. Edward Teach was born around 1680, probably in Bristol, England. He served as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, and when that war ended in 1713, he moved into piracy under the mentorship of Benjamin Hornigold in the Bahamas. Within 2 years, he commanded his own ship. Within 3 years, he had captured a large French slave ship, refitted her with 40 guns, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge. She was one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels ever to sail. His public image was by design terrifying. He was a tall man with an enormous black beard that he braided into thick locks and tied with slow-burning fuses of hempen cord. In battle, he lit the fuses so smoke and small flames curled around his face, giving him the appearance of a demon rising out of hell. He wore 3 pairs of pistols and a bandolier across his chest. He carried a cutlass and multiple daggers. He drank heavily. His whole persona was engineered to make merchants surrender without a fight. And it worked. In May 1718, he blockaded the entire city of Charleston, South Carolina, for nearly a week with his fleet. He held the port and its passengers hostage and demanded, of all things, a chest of medicines, likely mercury, which some historians speculate suggests he was suffering from syphilis. The city delivered. In June 1718, he deliberately grounded the Queen Anne's Revenge in Beaufort Inlet, took the best of the loot, and reduced his crew from around 300 to about 40 hand-picked men. He then accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina and settled briefly in the town of Bath. But he did not stay retired. Reports began circulating that Blackbeard was raiding local shipping and using his connections with Governor Eden as cover. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, decided to act without waiting for the Crown's authorization. He hired 2 shallow draft sloops out of his own pocket, put them under the command of Royal Navy First Lieutenant Robert Maynard, and sent them south to find Blackbeard in the shallow waters off North Carolina. Maynard tracked Blackbeard to a favorite anchorage in the shallow inlet at Ocracoke Island. On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, entered the inlet at dawn. Blackbeard, having been drinking through the night with a visiting merchant named Odell, was slow to react. When he realized he was being attacked by armed vessels, he cut his cables and tried to escape through the shallows. The Ranger ran aground on a sandbar. The Jane pressed forward. Blackbeard turned and fired a broadside from his sloop the Adventure, killing or wounding a large number of Maynard's men on the Jane. Maynard, thinking fast, ordered his surviving crew to hide below deck to make the Jane appear helpless. Blackbeard, seeing what he took to be a nearly empty ship, came alongside and threw his men onto the Jane's deck to finish off the survivors. That was the trap. Maynard's men, hidden below, poured out of the hold. What followed was one of the bloodiest hand-to-hand engagements ever recorded in the golden age of piracy. Blackbeard and Maynard closed on each other in the smoke. They drew pistols. Both fired. Maynard's bullet hit Blackbeard. Blackbeard's bullet missed. They drew cutlasses. Maynard's blade broke against Blackbeard's guard. Blackbeard raised his cutlass to finish him. Then a Highland sailor of Maynard's crew slashed Blackbeard across the neck from behind, and still Blackbeard fought. According to Maynard's own after-action report and to the accepted version of the fight, by the time Edward Teach finally collapsed on the deck of the Jane, he had absorbed 5 gunshot wounds and roughly 20 separate sword and cutlass wounds. He was, by every eyewitness account, still trying to draw another pistol when he died. When Maynard's men were sure he was dead, they severed his head from his body. The head was hoisted up to the bowsprit of the Jane and lashed there both as proof for Governor Spotswood's bounty and as a warning to any pirate along the American coast who might witness the sloop's return voyage. The body was thrown into the shallow water of the inlet. According to the legend that persists to this day at Ocracoke, the headless body swam 3 laps around the Jane before sinking beneath the waves. Historians agree that part is folklore. What is not folklore is that Blackbeard's head made the trip back to Hampton, Virginia, mounted on Maynard's bowsprit, as visible from every shore. It was later, by tradition, placed on a pole at the west end of the Hampton River at a spot still called Blackbeard's Point, where it remained on public display for years as a warning. As for what happened to the skull after that, the record fades into legend. The most persistent story, and it is legend, not confirmed fact, holds that the skull was eventually recovered and silver-plated to be used as an oversized drinking cup passed among wealthy Virginia families for generations as a curiosity. Museums have displayed alleged Blackbeard skull cups over the centuries. None has ever been authenticated. What is documented is that 13 of his surviving crew were hanged in Williamsburg the following March. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was rediscovered off the Beaufort Inlet in 1996 and is still being excavated today. His victims, the crews of the ships he had blockaded and boarded, mostly survived unharmed. Blackbeard, by design and by reputation, the most terrifying man ever to fly a Jolly Roger, died at 38 years old with 25 separate wounds in his body on the deck of a small sloop in shallow water, his beard still smoking from the fuses he had lit that morning. His head made the journey home to Virginia, lashed to the front of the vessel that killed him. His body swam, or did not swim, in a legend that will not die. And, 3 centuries later, his death remains the single most spectacular ending in the recorded history of piracy. 10 captains, 10 endings, Aruj Barbarossa's head, paraded to Spain and his cloak nailed inside a church. Klaus Störtebeker, beheaded on the Grosbrook, with 70 of his men. Olivier Levasseur hanging on reunion with a cipher no one has ever cracked. Jack Rackham in an iron cage on a rock in Kingston Harbor. Stede Bonnet weeping on the gallows with flowers in his hand. Charles Vane, betrayed by a friend, and gibbeted on Gun Cay. François Lolonais, torn to pieces and burned to ash on the jungle floor in Panama. Bartholomew Roberts killed by grape shot at breakfast and dropped overboard in crimson silk. William Kidd hanged twice and tarred over the Thames for 3 years. Edward Teach with 25 wounds and his head on a bowsprit. Every one of them was in the end a warning, nailed to a mast, hung in a cage, or scattered on the wind. The merchants they robbed mostly went home to their families. The captains did not. That was the price of the Black Flag, and every man on this list paid it in full.